a suicidal hanging.
Unfortunately, very true.
Part of the reason they get away with it is there's no investigative media anymore. The First Amendment, the press has fallen far short of what the Founding Fathers perceived its role in our government. If you think back to you may not be old enough, to the Watergate instance, when the press was dogged and investigated. That press in those days did exactly what the Founding Fathers thought, and that was to wanted them to do is to monitor the government, to report on what the government was doing. That doesn't happen anymore. And in fact, one of the documents that came out recently that there's been some press on is the FBI has a program of planting moles in the major media outlets, informants. And it's much like the CIA did years ago when they would plant someone in our government and wait for 20 or 30 years until they rose to a position of power and influence, with access to confidential information and an ability to direct policy or government action. So that has come out here within the last 3 weeks, that they had moles in these major media outlets, and you have to only assume that it was for two purposes. One is to obtain information about what, for example, lots of times the press will write a story about the government and have a confidential source. It's to find out who that source was, and also to direct stories or to kill stories that are embarrassing to the government.
Indeed, well, that will tie in to the reports of CIA's Operation Mockingbird and the repeated times in which the U.S. military has admitted that military psychological operations officers have been staffing various locations, including CNN's headquarters. So once again, there's multiple agencies infesting the mainstream media organs, and that's certainly one of the reasons why things like your brother's death do not get reported on. And that brings to mind the question regarding J.D. Cash, who you mentioned earlier. Is he still alive? Is he still working on this case?
No, J.D. died about 3 years ago.
I see, yes. I have read some of his reports, but I wasn't aware of it.
J.D. figured this out early on. What I've done, I'm stood on the shoulders of a giant, in J.D. Cash. I mean, J.D., it was a pleasure to work with J.D. for a few years. But J.D. figured it out right away, that the government had prior knowledge, they had informants. And he, like myself, could never reach a conclusion as to whether it was just the sting operation got away from the FBI or whether they actually wanted it to happen. Because people say, why would they want it to happen? Well, they always benefit. They increase funding. You have the Patriot Act and all the other surveillance, and the American people lose a number of their rights whenever one of these incidents happen, and we seem willing to give up those rights for what we think will be security in the future.
Absolutely, and that's unfortunately very true. And again, that was very much the case with the OKC bombing. And there is speculation of the files that were contained in the FBI offices in the building. There's speculation about a number of things related to the case and why the building itself was blown up so quickly afterwards, and all sorts of very unusual circumstances around the bombing itself. But getting back, I think we got a little bit off track from the question of the videotapes, and that brings up a report that was just released on April 10th from BigGovernment.com. Oklahoma City bombing videotapes subject of federal court hearing in Salt Lake City, May 11th. And this talks about a hearing that's going to take place with Judge Clark Waddups presiding in the U.S. District. Waddups presiding in the U.S. District Court for the District of Utah Central Division, and it comes some 3.5 years after Utah Attorney Jesse Trentadue used FOIA to request the FBI to turn over copies of surveillance video captured April 19th, 1995, etc., etc. Perhaps you can tell us about this hearing and what it's going to decide.
The hearing is over the mirror building tapes. It's a very significant case for a number of reasons. Obviously, the tapes. I mean, if I get access to the tapes, immediately go public, it'll show who carried out the attack on the Murrow building and who else was involved. But more important than that, it goes to the core of what is the government's responsibility under the Freedom of Information Act, the FOIA. The FBI's position, and it's the position they assert all over this country, that when someone asks for a document or a record that is potentially harmful to the Bureau, the response is, we looked for it and we can't find it. Their position is, all the law requires is for them to look. It does not require them to find and produce a record. And why this is significant in this case is the tapes exist. So it's not a case where they can say, we don't know if there is a record or not. In this case, there are tapes. The second reason it's significant is, in other instances, they've been able to assert a privilege from production. National security, an ongoing criminal investigation. There's a number of exemptions under FOIA that says you can't get records if they fall into these documents that are exempt from the Freedom of Information Act. They don't have that claim here. So we have the documents in existence. We don't have any privilege that protects them, the documents being the tapes or the records. No privilege that protects them. And the issue comes down to, is that all the law requires, is that the FBI look and report back to a judge that we can't find anything? And my position is that can't be the law, because the purpose of the Freedom of Information Act was to give the public access to what the government was doing. And this would it would eviscerate FOIA if all they had to do was say, we looked and wink, nod, we can't find anything. So my position is, once you know it exists and there's no privilege, you sure as hell have to find it and turn it over.
So I assume that currently they're trying to hold that they're not even obligated to talk about what that search involved or what types of records or in what way they were searching.
Oh, they said they did a computer search and they just can't find it. Well, I've seen in the past, and one of the documents I filed in support of my motion was from a retired FBI agent that said in the Oklahoma bombing case, they had what were called zero files. And this was evidence no one was to see. It goes into the zero file. I also found out in the course of my FOIA request, and this has become rather significant publicly, I happened across what the FBI calls iDrives. In a FOIA response or request, and in a criminal case, the FBI turns over in a FOIA case, they would search the official file for documents. It's the official file they turn over to the defense counsel in a criminal case. The iDrive, it's where evidence goes before it goes into the official file. And then the FBI makes a determination whether to put it in the official file or leave it in the iDrive where it's never recorded, never reported. And of course, they tell me only irrelevant evidence remains in the iDrive. All relevant evidence goes to the official file that's turned over to defense counsel and made available to the public on FOIA requests. Well, I don't for a moment believe them on that. I think what goes into the iDrive is the evidence that would acquit somebody or that's embarrassing to the government.
Absolutely. Well, I hate to be defeatist about this, but given the way that vital information and documentation about your brother's death has been systematically erased and destroyed, could you imagine that the